She had no idea anyone was listening. It was a summer evening in 1889, and the drought had already taken everything: the crops, the cattle, and every promise her husband had made before pneumonia carried him off 3 months prior. Rebecca Hartwell stood alone at a fence post in the dying light, her hands pressed flat against the rotting wood, listening to the sound of 5 hungry children crying on the other side of a wall, too thin to hide anything. She had walked 6 miles that day looking for work. She had come home with nothing. And in the most desperate moment of her life, she pressed her eyes shut and whispered a vow into the empty air. Not to anyone, not to anything, only to herself. I'll do any job, endure any hardship, sacrifice anything, if it only means my children can eat. She thought she was alone. She was not. Cole Brennan, the silent, solitary rancher who owned the land next door, who had spent 12 years building a wall of quiet around his life, so methodically he'd nearly forgotten it was a wall, was standing in the shadow of a dead cedar tree not 20 feet away. He heard every single word. And something in those words struck him deeper than anything had struck him in years. What happened next would change both of them forever. This is the story of a mother who refused to break, a lonely man who refused to look away, a fire that burned down everything they had built, and the one thing no flame on earth could ever take from them. If this story moves you, hit that like button and drop the name of your city in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now, let's begin. The drought came without apology. It didn't creep across the land the way most disasters do, slowly, giving people time to prepare, time to grieve, time to run. No. This one arrived like a verdict already decided, like a sentence handed down from a sky that had simply stopped caring. By the 3rd week of June, the creek beds had cracked open like old wounds, the cattle were leaning against fence posts with hollow eyes, and the earth itself had turned the color of old bone. Farmers who had worked the same plots of land for 20 years stood at the edges of their fields and stared at nothing, because nothing was exactly what they had left. For Rebecca Hartwell, the drought was only the most recent cruelty in a season that had already taken everything. Her husband, Daniel, had died in April. Not from anything dramatic, not from a fall or a fire, or the kind of tragedy that gets turned into a song. He died from pneumonia in the small back bedroom of a rented house, with Rebecca holding his hand and their 5 children asleep in the next room. He died quietly, the way good men sometimes do, as if even in death he was trying not to be a burden. He was 34 years old. He had calloused hands and a laugh that started somewhere low in his chest. He had promised Rebecca on the night their youngest was born that he would never leave her to face this world alone. He had meant it with everything he had. But promises and pneumonia don't negotiate. By the time June arrived, Rebecca had exhausted every option a woman in her position was permitted to exhaust. She had sold the furniture piece by piece. First the wardrobe, then the chairs, then the table that Daniel had built with his own hands the winter before their eldest was born. She had sewn through the night until her fingers bled, taking in mending work from women who paid her in coins and sometimes in nothing at all. She had walked to every farm and every ranch within a 7-mile radius, asking for work with her chin level and her voice steady, because she refused, absolutely refused, to let her children see her break. They were breaking anyway. She could see it in their faces. Thomas was 12, old enough to understand what was happening, and young enough that understanding it was destroying him. He had started waking before dawn, slipping out of the house before anyone could stop him, trying to find odd jobs in town so that he could bring something home. Rebecca always made him give the money back. She couldn't explain it properly, couldn't find the words to tell him that watching her 12-year-old son carry the weight of a man would unravel her faster than the hunger would. Clara was 10, and she had gone quiet in a way that frightened Rebecca more than any amount of crying would have. Clara used to sing, not well, but constantly, little made-up songs about horses and clouds and whatever she'd seen that day. She hadn't sung since Daniel died. Now she just watched Rebecca's face when she came home empty-handed, watched the bread disappear from the tin, watched the younger ones with careful, ancient eyes. The twins, Eli and May, were 7. They still cried when they were hungry, which was every night now because 7 is too young to learn how to swallow that kind of pain quietly. And the youngest, little Jesse, was barely 4 years old. He had Daniel's eyes, that particular shade of brown that looked almost gold in firelight. And he had recently learned that if he pressed his fist against his stomach and squeezed his eyes shut, the hunger hurt a little less. Rebecca knew this because she had taught herself the same trick. The evening it happened, the evening that would divide her life into before and after, began like every other evening that terrible summer. She had walked 6 miles to the Alderman farm, where a woman named Doris Alderman had told her 3 days prior that there might be laundry work available. There was not. Doris Alderman met her at the gate with an expression that was half pity and half something uglier, something that wanted to feel better about itself by looking down at Rebecca's worn shoes and the fraying hem of her dress. "I'm afraid we've made other arrangements," Doris said, not quite meeting her eyes. "I see," Rebecca said. She walked home. 6 miles in June heat, with nothing to show for it, back to a rented house where the landlord's patience was measured in days, not weeks, and where 5 children were waiting for whatever she might bring through the door. She brought nothing. The sun was going down by the time she turned onto the dirt road that led to the house, and it painted the whole sky in shades of copper and ash, beautiful the way only indifferent things can be, gorgeous and utterly unaware of anyone's suffering. She stopped at the edge of the property and stood there for a moment, just breathing, because she had learned that sometimes you need 30 seconds between the world's cruelty and your children's faces. 30 seconds to put yourself back together. 30 seconds to become, again, the version of yourself your children needed you to be. Through the thin walls of the house, she could hear them. May was crying first, that particular high note she hit when the hunger got bad, a sound that Rebecca felt in the base of her sternum like something being pulled loose. Then Eli joined in, because the twins had always shared everything, including their pain. And underneath both of them, quieter but somehow louder, she could hear Jesse's voice. "Mama? Mama, come home?" Something in Rebecca's chest came apart. She didn't go inside. Not yet. She couldn't. She stood at the edge of her own property in the dying light, and she pressed her hands flat against the rough wood of the fence post, and she let herself feel, for exactly 30 seconds, the full and terrible weight of what she was carrying. And then, in a voice so low it was barely more than breath, she made her promise. Not to any listening sky, not to Daniel's memory, though she felt him close on evenings like this. She made it to herself in the way that desperate people sometimes do when they've run out of every other option. When the only authority left that seems real is the one inside your own chest. "I'll do any job," she whispered. "I'll endure any hardship. I'll sacrifice anything at all, if it means my children can eat." The words fell into the dry summer air and seemed to disappear. She didn't know anyone was listening. Cole Brennan heard every word. He hadn't meant to. He was standing on the far side of the fence line, partially hidden by the shadow of a dead cedar tree, checking the condition of the posts along the boundary of his property. The Hartwell rentals sat adjacent to the western edge of the Brennan ranch, though Cole rarely paid attention to who came and went. He kept to himself. He had kept to himself for so long that it had stopped feeling like a choice and started feeling like a fact of nature, like the color of the sky or the hardness of the ground. He was 41 years old. He had built the Brennan Ranch with 12 years of work so relentless it had cost him nearly everything else worth having. He had no wife. He had no children. He had 1,800 acres of good land, a solid house, a reliable crew of ranch hands, and the particular kind of quiet that exists inside a life that has slowly emptied itself of everything soft. He had been fine with that. He told himself he had been fine with that. He stood in the shadow of the dead cedar and listened to Rebecca Hartwell's whispered vow, and something happened inside him that he wouldn't be able to name for a very long time. It wasn't pity. He knew what pity felt like, and this wasn't it. Pity kept its distance. Pity looked from the outside in. What Cole felt standing there in the failing light was something closer to recognition, the particular ache of hearing someone say out loud the thing you yourself have never been able to say, the thing you've only ever felt in the dark. He had never been willing to sacrifice anything. That was the truth he'd never spoken. He had worked and built and acquired and fortified, and he had told himself that was enough, that it was more than most men managed. But he had never offered his hands to anything that might cost him the way Rebecca Hartwell had just offered hers. He had never stood at the edge of everything and said, "I will endure. I will not stop. Not for anything." She was inside the house by the time he moved. He could hear the children settling, the crying tapering into exhausted quiet. He stood there for another long moment, one hand resting on the fence post she had touched, and he thought about what a person owed the world, and what the world owed a woman like that, and whether those two things ever actually balanced out. He didn't think they did. He didn't sleep well that night. Cole's bedroom was at the back of the ranch house, facing east, and he lay on top of the covers in the heat and stared at the ceiling and thought about the sound of her voice. Not the words exactly, though the words kept coming back too, but the texture of it, the steadiness underneath the desperation. Most people, when they were that close to breaking, let their voices go thin and high and frantic. Hers had gone the opposite direction, lower, quieter, more deliberate, as if she was driving the promise like a nail into something solid, making it permanent. He thought about the children. He had seen them a few times over the past weeks, 5 of them, ranging from a small, serious-looking boy down to a tiny one who still toddled when he walked. He'd seen the oldest one, the boy, working the road into town at an hour when boys that age should have been sleeping. He hadn't thought much of it at the time, or told himself he hadn't. He was telling himself a lot of things, lately, that he suspected weren't entirely true. By 4 in the morning, he was up, standing in his kitchen in the dark, one hand wrapped around a cup of coffee that had gone cold, thinking about what the reasonable thing to do was. The reasonable thing, by the standards of Harlan County in 1889, was nothing. A widow's poverty was a widow's business. People kept to their own. That was the code, and Cole had kept it without question his entire adult life. But he kept hearing her voice. "I'll endure any hardship. I'll sacrifice anything." He set down the cup. He went out to the barn. He didn't approach her that first day. He wasn't sure why. Maybe because he needed to be certain, needed to watch long enough that he wasn't acting on a single overheard moment in the dark. So he watched from a distance, the way he had always done, the way that had become so habitual he barely recognized it as anything other than caution. What he saw dismantled every excuse he might have made. She was up before the sun. He could see the lamplight in the window of the little rental house from his position near the barn. She was out the door before most of his ranch hands had finished breakfast, walking that long road into town with her head up and her back straight, and that particular kind of tiredness in her stride that isn't the tiredness of one bad night, but of 100 of them, accumulated and carried forward. He watched her go, and then, without fully deciding to, he followed at a distance. She went to the laundry house first, a long, low building near the center of town, where she had apparently established herself as someone willing to take in work. He watched her through the window, moving between the great steaming tubs with quick, efficient hands, her face composed and distant, speaking only when spoken to and only then to negotiate the terms of whatever job was being offered. She was quiet in a way that seemed deliberate, the kind of quiet that keeps its own counsel, that doesn't offer more than necessary because it can't afford to. She carried 3 heavy loads of finished laundry to their owners before noon. Cole tracked her route from a distance, feeling vaguely ridiculous but unable to stop. She collected 2 small coins from the first house, nothing from the second. He saw the door close in her face, saw her stand there a moment with her hand still raised, then lower it and turn away with no change in her expression, and a promise of future payment from the third. By mid-afternoon, she was at the other end of town, knocking on the door of a seamstress who apparently had more mending than she could manage alone. The seamstress hired her for 2 hours. Rebecca worked without sitting down. She walked home in the early evening carrying a small paper package. He couldn't see what was in it from this distance, but from the way she held it, he could tell it was the only thing she'd managed to buy, and from the size of it, he knew it wasn't enough. He watched her go inside. He stood in the road and felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, something hot and uncomfortable and difficult to name. And then he turned around and walked back to the ranch. He came to her on the 4th day. He had spent 3 days building up to it, which was more preparation than he had given to most of the significant decisions of his life. He told himself it was because he needed to think it through properly. What to say, how to make sure it didn't come across as charity, because he had watched her long enough to know that charity was something she would refuse at the door without a second thought. It needed to be business. It needed to be an exchange, a transaction, something she could accept without cost to her dignity. He thought about that, about dignity, about what it meant to a woman in her position. He had money enough and more. And in his younger years, he might have assumed that money was what a person in Rebecca Hartwell's situation most needed, that you could simply offer the money and solve the problem, and that would be that. He understood now, watching her, that he had been wrong about that for a long time. What she needed was work, real work, the kind that let her feel her hands in what she built, that let her stand straight at the end of the day and say, "I earned this." Money offered without that was just a different kind of humiliation, so he went to her with a job. He knocked on the door of the rental house at 7 in the morning, and when she opened it, he could see immediately that she had been up for hours, that there was flour on her hands and something careful in her expression, like a door that's been locked so many times the mechanism is starting to wear. He took his hat off and he said, "Mrs. Hartwell, my name is Brennan. I own the ranch that adjoins your property to the west. I understand you're looking for work." She looked at him for a moment without saying anything. Her eyes were a particular shade of gray-green that he noticed immediately, and that struck him later as the color of weather, the color of the sky right before it decided what it was going to do. "Who told you that?" she said. "Nobody had to," he said. "I've been watching the road for weeks. You're out before dawn every day and you come back after dark. Town that size doesn't have enough work for a woman as capable as you. I have a ranch that does." She studied him. He stood still and let her. "What kind of work?" she said. "Cooking for the ranch hands to start," he said. "I've got 8 men and no one who knows what to do with a kitchen. Beyond that, mending, laundry, organizing the supply ledgers. The house has been running without a woman's management for 12 years, and it shows." He paused. "I pay fair wages. You and your children can live in the foreman's cottage. It's been empty since my last foreman moved his family to Abilene. It's not large, but it's sound." She didn't say anything for a long moment. He watched her face do something complicated. He couldn't follow all of it, but he recognized the part where she was calculating, measuring the offer against everything her pride told her to refuse, weighing the safety of her position against the faces of her children. "I don't take charity, Mr. Brennan," she said. "I know you don't," he said. "I'm not offering it. I'm offering employment. If you don't earn your wages, I'll let you know." Another silence. From somewhere inside the house, he heard a child cough, then small feet on bare boards, then a tiny voice. "Mama?" Rebecca turned her head slightly toward the sound. When she turned back, something had shifted in her face, not broken open, not surrendered, but rearranged, reorganized around a different priority. "I'd want to see the cottage before I agreed to anything," she said. "Of course," Cole said. She saw the cottage. It was small, 2 rooms and a loft, with a cast-iron stove that needed cleaning and windows that let in the western light in long, dusty shafts. There was a porch with a broken step that Thomas would later fix, and a patch of ground beside it where someone had once started a garden and given up. The walls were solid. The roof was sound. There was a well 20 yards from the door. Rebecca walked through it slowly, touching the windowsills, testing the floorboards, opening the stove door and looking inside. She stood in the center of the larger room for a moment and was quiet. Cole waited outside, giving her the space. When she came out, she was looking at the well. "My children would need meals," she said. "That would have to be part of the arrangement, not charity, included in the wage." "That's reasonable," Cole said. "Thomas, my oldest, he's 12. He's a good worker. He'd want to help on the ranch." "I'd put him to work," Cole said. "Age-appropriate work." She looked at him directly for the first time since the conversation had begun. Those gray-green eyes, steady and measuring. "Why are you doing this, Mr. Brennan?" He considered the honest answer, which was complicated, and chose a portion of it. "Because I have a ranch that needs running and a house that needs managing," he said. "And because I've watched you walk that road every day for 3 weeks, carrying more than any one person should have to carry, and it seems to me that I have more than I need, and you have less than you're owed. That's not charity. That's just arithmetic." She was quiet for a long moment. "I'd want to be paid at the end of each week," she said. "Done," he said. "And I want it understood, clearly understood, that this is an employment arrangement, nothing else." "Nothing else," he said. She nodded once, The way people nod when they've made a decision they know they can't unmake, when they've stepped off a ledge and the ground is already rising. "We'll come tomorrow," she said. That evening, she told her children. Thomas listened with his arms crossed and his jaw set, 12-year-old skepticism wearing its most adult face, and then asked a series of questions that were so practical and so thorough that Rebecca had to work hard to keep the pride off her face. "Does he seem like a fair man?" Thomas asked. "I believe so," Rebecca said. "What about the other ranch hands? Are they decent people?" "I don't know yet. We'll find out." "And if they're not, then we'll leave," she said. "But we'll leave better off than we are now, Thomas. We'll have eaten." He thought about this for a moment, then nodded, with the gravity of someone much older. Clara didn't ask questions. She just watched Rebecca's face with those careful, ancient eyes, and after a while she went to the corner of the room and began folding the children's things, neatly, methodically, preparing for the move with quiet efficiency. Somewhere in there, Rebecca thought she heard Clara humming. Barely, just a thread of sound. But it was there. The twins wanted to know if there were horses. Jesse fell asleep in Rebecca's lap before she could finish explaining, his fist pressed against his stomach the way it always was now. She looked down at his face, those gold-brown eyes closed, that small chest rising and falling, and she felt the weight of her promise like something physical. She had made it in the dark, standing at a fence post, more desperate than she had ever been in her life. Tomorrow, something might actually shift. She held her sleeping son and listened to her daughters moving quietly around the small room, and tried to remember the last time she had felt anything that resembled hope. It was a fragile thing. She didn't trust it yet, but she didn't push it away either. They arrived at the Brennan ranch at 7 the next morning, the 5 children arranged behind Rebecca like a small, solemn parade. The ranch hands stopped what they were doing and watched. Some of them looked curious. A couple looked skeptical in the way that men look when they think something is going to make their lives more complicated. Cole met them at the gate. He had cleaned up, not dressed differently exactly, but there was something more deliberate about him than the day before. A formality in the way he held himself that Rebecca recognized as someone who understood that first impressions were being taken. He crouched down to eye level with the younger children, which surprised her. Men of his type, ranchers, landowners, men who managed other men, didn't usually bother. "This must be Jesse," he said to the smallest one, who was clutching Rebecca's skirt with both hands and staring at Cole with enormous eyes. Jesse stared at him for a long moment. Then he said, "You got horses?" Cole looked up at Rebecca briefly. She thought she saw something shift at the corner of his mouth. "I've got 14 of them," he told Jesse. "Maybe after your mama gets settled, I'll show you which ones are the friendly ones." Jesse considered this. He released Rebecca's skirt. It was, Rebecca would think later, a small thing. Such a small thing. A grown man crouching down and speaking seriously to a 4-year-old boy, promising him horses in a tone that made it clear the promise would be kept. But after months of a world that had given her children nothing but cold and hunger and the slow erosion of everything they should have been able to count on, a kept promise felt like something close to miraculous. She picked up her bag and walked through the gate, one step at a time. The first week was harder than she had expected, and she had expected it to be hard. The kitchen was a disaster. Not dirty, exactly, but disorganized in the way that spaces get when no one with any real system has been in charge of them for a long time. Things were in the wrong places. Supplies were intermixed without logic. The pantry inventory bore no relationship to actual reality. The first morning, she spent 3 hours simply reorganizing the space before she could cook anything at all. And when she finally got breakfast on the table, salt pork, cornbread, boiled coffee, nothing impressive but hot and plentiful, the ranch hands ate it with the kind of silence that comes before any verdict. One of them, a weathered man in his 50s named Hatch, who apparently served as the informal leader of the crew, looked up at her when he finished and said, "That's the best meal I've had in this kitchen in 4 years." It wasn't a compliment dressed up to be kind. It was a statement of fact. Rebecca recognized the difference. "I'll be better when I know the pantry properly," she said. Hatch nodded and went back to work. The children adjusted in their separate ways and at their separate speeds. Thomas threw himself into ranch work with an intensity that Cole mentioned to her, carefully, at the end of the first week. Not to complain, but to quietly suggest that the boy might need permission to slow down sometimes. that he seemed to think he had something to prove. Rebecca thanked him and had a conversation with Thomas that left them both slightly red-eyed and Thomas considerably less rigid in the shoulders. Clara found the ranch's stray cat, a scarred, one-eared tomcat who had apparently lived behind the barn for 2 years without being claimed by anyone, and adopted him with the decisive authority of someone who had been waiting for exactly this responsibility. She named him Captain. Within a week, Captain was sleeping at the foot of her bed. The twins, Eli and May, became fixtures in the barn, underfoot and irrepressible and apparently indestructible, getting into every corner of the place with the fearless curiosity of children who have recently been reminded that the world can also be interesting, not just dangerous. And Jesse. Jesse learned which horses were the friendly ones because Cole kept his promise. There were mornings, in those first weeks, when Rebecca would stand in the kitchen before anyone else was up. She was always the first up, always, and watch the sun come over the eastern hills through the window above the sink and feel the strangeness of being somewhere that felt, despite everything, like it might last. The ranch was solid in a way the rental house had never been. The walls were thick, the floors didn't shift. Outside there were animals and land and space, and somewhere in the house her children were sleeping in actual beds, with actual food in their stomachs. She didn't let herself feel grateful yet. Gratitude felt premature, felt like tempting something. She was still too close to the weeks before, too aware of how quickly things could reverse, to allow herself that particular vulnerability. But she noticed the solidity of the walls. She noticed that Jesse wasn't pressing his fist to his stomach anymore. She noticed one morning that Clara was humming again, clearly now, loud enough to hear from the next room, one of those made-up songs about clouds and horses. She turned back to the stove and kept working, but her hands, she realized, had stopped shaking. Cole Brennan said almost nothing for the first 3 weeks. This was not unusual behavior for Cole. He had always been a man of few words, had learned early that silence was a more honest currency than conversation. But there was something different about this silence, something he was aware of in a way he wouldn't have been 6 months ago. He was watching. He noticed things he would previously have had no occasion to notice. He noticed the way she organized the supply ledgers, not just efficiently, but with a kind of underlying logic that made the whole system easier to navigate, that seemed to anticipate the questions you'd want to ask before you asked them. He noticed that the ranch hands, who had been cautious about her in that particular way that men are cautious about changes they didn't vote for, had come around completely by the end of the second week. Not because she had charmed them or deferred to them, but because she had quietly demonstrated, through the simple evidence of full plates and a functioning kitchen, that she was extremely good at what she did. He noticed that Thomas, the 12-year-old who had arrived with his arms crossed and his jaw set, was learning to ride a horse with a focus and a natural ease that Cole hadn't seen in a boy that age in a long time. He promoted him from fence checking to helping with the younger horses, which Thomas received with the careful expressionlessness of someone trying very hard not to show how much it meant to him. He noticed that the ranch house, which had been running on a kind of resigned institutional inertia for 12 years, had started to feel different. Not softer exactly. He would have resisted that word. More like a mechanism that had been running slightly out of alignment and had been quietly, incrementally adjusted. He noticed all of this. He tried not to think too carefully about what it meant. She came to him on the evening of the 21st day. Not to speak, she knocked on the door of his office, which was at the back of the house, and when he opened it, she was holding a paper in her hands that he recognized as the supply ledger. "You've been overpaying your grain supplier by about 15%, she said. "There are 2 other suppliers in the county. I wrote to both of them this week. This is their pricing." She handed him the paper. He looked at it. "You wrote to them yourself?" "I used the ranch's stationery," she said. "If that was presumptuous, It wasn't," he said. She nodded. "There's also a gap in the supply inventory for the past 3 years. Someone's been recording what was ordered, but not what was actually received. The numbers don't match." A pause. "I don't know who's responsible. I thought you should know before I went further." He looked at her for a moment. "How long did it take you to find that?" 3 evenings. He set down the paper. "I'll look into it." She nodded again and turned to go. "Mrs. Hartwell." She paused. "Thank you," he said. She turned back just slightly. Not all the way around, just enough that he could see the edge of her profile, the line of her jaw. "That's what you're paying me for, Mr. Brennan," she said. And then she was gone. Cole stood in the doorway of his office for a long moment after she left, holding the paper with the grain pricing, and tried to remember the last time anyone had walked into this room with something useful, something that mattered, something that assumed, without asking permission, that the work was worth doing. He couldn't remember. He sat down and started reading. The supply discrepancy Rebecca had uncovered turned out to be worse than either of them had anticipated. It took Cole 4 days to trace it back to its source. 4 days of cross-referencing delivery records and payment ledgers, and the careful notations Rebecca had made in that methodical handwriting of hers. The numbers so precise they seemed to push back against any attempt to misread them. When he finally had the full picture, he sat at his desk for a long time without moving. The man responsible was Grady Sills, his senior ranch hand, not Hatch, who Cole would have trusted with his life, but Grady, who had been with the ranch for 6 years and whom Cole had considered, without much examination, to be reliable. Grady hadn't been stealing large amounts at once. He'd been too careful for that. Small skims, repeated over time, the kind of thing that requires patience and the reasonable confidence that no one is watching closely enough to notice. He had been right about that, until Rebecca Hartwell arrived with 3 evenings of careful attention and a mind that apparently filed numbers the way other people filed grievances, permanently and in precise order. Cole confronted Grady on a Tuesday morning out by the south fence where the man was working alone. He kept his voice flat and his face neutral, the way he had learned to do when the alternative was something he'd regret. Grady denied it for about 45 seconds, long enough to realize that Cole already had everything, that the numbers were not going to rearrange themselves into an innocent story, no matter how hard he tried. And then he stopped denying it and went quiet. "I'll need you off the property by sundown," Cole said. 6 years, Grady said. "I put 6 years into this ranch." "I know you did." Cole looked at him steadily. "You also put 6 years into skimming it. I'm not calling the sheriff on you, Grady, but I want you gone by sundown." He walked back to the ranch house without looking back. At dinner that evening, when the hands were settling around the table and the sound of boots on floorboards and chairs scraping had reached its usual familiar pitch, Hatch leaned toward Cole and said quietly, "Word got around about Grady." "I figured it would," Cole said. "The men want to know who found it." Cole was quiet for a moment. At the far end of the kitchen, Rebecca was moving between the stove and the counter with her usual focused efficiency, her back to the room. He watched her for a second, then said, "The ledgers found it. That's enough." Hatch looked at the back of Rebecca's head, then back at Cole. He said nothing more, but the expression on his face was the expression of a man who has just confirmed something he already suspected. Rebecca, for her part, said nothing about it at all. She had given Cole the information and stepped back, and she did not ask what he had done with it or insert herself into the consequence. This was, Cole recognized, a form of respect he hadn't encountered in quite this shape before. Not deference, because there was nothing deferential about Rebecca Hartwell, but a clear-eyed understanding of where her role ended and his began, and a refusal to blur those lines for the sake of curiosity or credit. He found himself respecting it more than he knew how to say. What he didn't know, what he wouldn't have known, because she kept it entirely to herself, was that the evening after Grady left the ranch, Rebecca sat on the steps of the foreman's cottage in the dark and allowed herself, for the first time in months, to feel something that wasn't fear or exhaustion or the particular grinding anxiety of a woman counting days. She felt useful, not in the desperate, scrambling way of the weeks before the ranch, not the usefulness of a woman doing anything she can find just to keep her children fed, but in the specific, grounded way of someone who had applied her actual abilities to a real problem and produced a real result. It was a small thing. It felt enormous. Inside the cottage, she could hear Clara reading aloud to the twins. Something about a sea captain, her voice doing different characters with a confidence she'd never had before. And Jesse's occasional interjections, and Hatch's dog, who had adopted the children completely and was apparently now sleeping in their room without anyone having officially decided to allow this. The sounds layered over each other in the warm night air, ordinary and improbable all at once. Rebecca pressed her palms flat on the wooden step, the way she had pressed them against the fence post the evening she'd made her promise, and she breathed. She still didn't trust it, but she was starting to understand that trust might not be the right instrument for this particular situation. Trust was something you extended toward the future. What she was learning to do was something different, learning to let the present moment be what it was, without immediately bracing for its end. It was harder than it sounded. She was working on it. The town's attention arrived the way small-town attention always does, gradually and then all at once, wearing the face of concern. It started with questions, innocent ones, at first, the kind that came wrapped in neighborly small talk at the general store, or after Sunday service, or at the post office counter. How are you settling in, Rebecca? And the children, are they well? And Cole Brennan, does he treat you fairly? That last one always delivered with a particular careful emphasis. The words weighted just enough to let you know the question was really something else. Rebecca answered them all with the same steady courtesy. She was well. The children were well. Mr. Brennan was a fair employer. She bought her supplies, she collected the mail, and she walked back to the ranch without offering more than she'd been asked for. But small towns are not satisfied by answers. Small towns are satisfied by stories, and a widow and 5 children living on a bachelor rancher's property was, to Harlan County, a story that practically told itself. The only question was which version would stick. The version that was gaining traction by the 6th week was not a kind one. She heard it first from a woman named Patrice Holbrook, who had the decency, or perhaps the particular cruelty, to say it to Rebecca's face rather than behind her back. They were standing outside the general store on a Wednesday afternoon, Rebecca with a basket over her arm, and Patrice with the expression of a woman who has decided she is doing someone a favor. People are talking, Patrice said. I thought you should know. They're saying it isn't proper. A woman your age in a man's house with no husband to account for things. She paused. I'm sure you understand how it looks. Rebecca looked at her for a moment. She was aware of the weight of the basket on her arm, of the specific tiredness behind her eyes, of the 6 miles she still had to walk before sunset. How it looks, she repeated. People have standards, Rebecca, particularly for a woman alone. I see, Rebecca said. And what do people say about my children eating? Is there a standard for that as well? Patrice opened her mouth and then closed it again. Good afternoon, Mrs. Holbrook, Rebecca said, and walked away. She didn't let herself shake until she was out of sight. The conversation with Patrice Holbrook was the first of several, and the subsequent ones were less civil. There were women who crossed to the other side of the street when they saw her coming. There was a Sunday when she brought the children to town for supplies, and found that the welcome that had existed, tentative and provisional as it had been, had retracted entirely, replaced by the particular chill of a community that has made a collective decision about someone and is enforcing it with silence and turned shoulders. Thomas noticed. He was 12 and sharp, and he had been reading adult situations accurately since the month after his father died. He said nothing to Rebecca directly, but she could see him processing it, the tightening around his eyes when someone looked past them, the way he moved closer to the younger children when they were in town, as if his body understood before his mind did that they might need him to close ranks. Clara also noticed and said nothing, in her particular way of noticing everything and saying nothing. But Captain the One-Eared Cat received an unusual amount of attention that evening, which was Clara's version of emotional processing. The twins were blissfully oblivious, which was a mercy. Jessie asked on the walk home from one particularly icy visit to town why the lady in the hat hadn't said hello to them. Rebecca told him some people were having a hard day. Jessie considered this and said that when he had a hard day, Mama hugged him, and maybe the lady needed a hug. Rebecca told him that was probably true. She held his hand for the rest of the walk and did not say anything else, Cole found out through Hatch, which was the way Cole generally found out about most things that happened outside his immediate field of vision. Hatch was not a gossip. He was, in fact, constitutionally opposed to gossip, but he operated on the principle that his employer needed to know things that affected the running of the ranch, and the town's opinion of Rebecca Hartwell was starting, in Hatch's assessment, to qualify. He told Cole on a Thursday evening, leaning against the fence near the barn, with the directness of a man who sees no virtue in building up to difficult things. People in town are talking about the widow, he said. Not kindly. Cole said nothing. Rufus Kane is involved, Hatch added, spreading it, making it worse than it would be on its own. This changed the temperature of the conversation. Rufus Kane was not a gossip or a moral arbiter. He was a land speculator. and an effective one, and his interest in other people's business was never casual. He had been trying to acquire the western portion of the Brennan Ranch's grazing land for 3 years, approaching Cole with offers that were consistently too low and consistently refused. A man like Cain didn't spread rumors about a widow's virtue out of community concern. He spread them because they served a purpose. "What's he saying?" Cole asked. Hatch told him. Cole's jaw tightened by degrees as Hatch spoke, until by the end of it, his face had gone to that particular stillness that people who knew him recognized as the dangerous kind. Not anger that was going to explode, but anger that had gone very cold and very deliberate. "He's trying to get her to leave," Cole said. It wasn't a question. "More likely he's trying to get you to send her away," Hatch said. "Man like Cain knows a scandal is a lever. He wants you rattled. He wants the situation complicated enough that you'd rather clean it up than fight it." Cole looked out over the land, his land, 1,800 acres of it, built year by year with work that had cost him more than he'd ever totaled up. He thought about Rufus Cain's office in town with its leather chairs and its framed maps with properties outlined in red pencil. He thought about the way Cain always smiled when he made an offer, like the smile was part of the transaction, like pleasantness was something he had decided to wear because it was useful. He thought about Rebecca Hartwell standing at a fence post in the dark, whispering a promise to 5 hungry children. "Nothing's going to change," Cole said. Hatch nodded, once. "Figured as much. Wanted you to know about Cain, though." "Appreciated," Cole said. He went inside. He sat at his desk for a long time that evening, not looking at the ledgers, not doing anything in particular. He was thinking, the way he thought about the large things, slowly, without rushing it, letting the full shape of the situation become clear before he decided what to do about it. The situation was this. A woman with more character than most people he'd known in his entire life was being made into a scandal by a man who needed a lever. She was being penalized for the simple fact of surviving, for the practical necessity of accepting work that was real and fairly compensated and that she had earned every single day since arriving on this ranch. The town was letting it happen, some of them enthusiastically, some of them passively, some of them the way people always participate in cruelties they haven't examined closely enough to identify as cruelties. And Cole Brennan, who had kept to himself for 41 years and built a wall of silence around his life so methodically that he'd nearly forgotten it was a wall, was sitting in his office trying to decide if this was something he was going to address or something he was going to absorb quietly, the way he had absorbed most things. He already knew the answer. He had known it since Hatch finished talking. He was just sitting with it long enough to be certain it was coming from the right place. It was. He got up and went to find Rebecca. She was on the cottage porch, which had become her custom in the late evenings after the children were settled, sitting on the top step with a mending basket beside her and whatever faint breeze the summer night offered, working by lamplight with those quick, efficient hands. She looked up when she heard him coming, and her face went immediately careful in the way it did when she was preparing to receive information she might not want. He sat down on the step below hers, which put them nearly at eye level, and told her what Hatch had told him. He kept it straightforward, without decoration. She deserved the truth in its actual shape. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, her hands still in her lap, the mending set aside. Then she said, "Cain, he's the one who owns the land office on Cutter Street." "He does. He was watching me the first week I started going into town for supplies. I noticed him looking." She paused. "I didn't understand what it meant at the time." "It means he's been thinking about this for a while," Cole said, "using you as a way to create pressure." She turned and looked at him directly. "And are you under pressure?" "No," he said. She held his gaze for a moment, and he held it back, and he understood that she was not asking whether he was bothered by the rumors. She was asking whether he was going to act on them, whether the gossip was going to become the reason he needed to reconsider the arrangement, whether she was going to have to start recalculating again. "This doesn't change anything," he said. "I want that to be clear. You work for this ranch. You earn your wages. Your children are safe here. None of that is subject to what Rufus Cain tells people over dinner in town." Something moved through her face. Not relief exactly, because relief implies that she had been afraid, and Rebecca Hartwell did not present her fear openly. But something shifted. Some small held thing released. "It's going to get worse before it gets better," she said. "Probably," he agreed. My children are going to hear things. Yes. Thomas already knows something is wrong. She looked out at the dark yard. He's 12. He shouldn't have to know this. No, Cole said. He shouldn't. A pause. But he does, and he's handling it. She glanced at him. How do you know? Because I watched him in town last week, when that woman on the corner looked straight through all of you. He moved in front of the younger ones without thinking about it, just repositioned himself. Cole shook his head slightly. That's a boy who knows exactly what's happening and has already decided what he's going to do about it. Rebecca was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was low and even, the way it got when she was keeping it controlled by force. He's too young to have to do that, she said. Yes, Cole said. He is. Neither of them said anything for a while. The summer night pressed in around them, thick with the smell of dry grass and warm cedar, and somewhere out past the barn one of the horses shifted and blew softly in the dark. After a while, Rebecca picked up the mending again. Thank you for telling me, she said. I prefer to know things as they are. I know you do, Cole said. He stood up and put his hat back on. He was at the edge of the porch when she said, Mr. Brennan. He turned. She was looking at the mending in her hands, not at him. You didn't have to come tell me yourself, she said. You could have just let me find out from someone in town and handled it from your end and never said anything directly. A beat. You didn't have to come. He thought about what to say. He settled on the simplest version of the truth. I know what it's like, he said, to have things decided about you without your knowledge. I don't do that to people if I can help it. She looked up at him then, and he saw in her face, briefly and without armor, something that might have been the beginning of actual trust. Not the working arrangement kind, not the practical exchange of services kind, the rarer kind. He went back to the house before either of them could make something of it. The confrontation with Rufus Kane happened, as confrontations often do, not at a time of Cole's choosing. It was a Saturday, and Cole had come to town for supplies and the week's business. The feed merchant, the assayer's office, the bank. He had been in Harlan County long enough that his presence in town required a certain amount of navigation, a series of brief professional exchanges with people who wanted his business, or his goodwill, or his ear, and who had learned over 12 years of dealing with him that they were not going to get more than a fair amount of his time. Kane found him outside the bank. He was a compact man in his mid-50s, Rufus Kane, with the kind of face that had been good-looking once and had curdled into something shrewder. He dressed better than most men in town, which was not an accident. Cole had always understood that Kane's clothes were part of his argument. The visual claim that he was a man whose judgment could be trusted because he could obviously afford good fabric. Cole, he said, falling into step beside him, with the ease of a man who has never learned that his company might not be wanted. Haven't had a chance to catch you. Rufus, Cole said, and kept walking. Heard you've had some changes out at the ranch, a new domestic arrangement. The word domestic had been selected with care. How's that working out? Cole stopped walking. He turned and looked at Kane with the full weight of his attention, which was the kind of attention that most people preferred in smaller doses. Say what you want to say, Cole told him. Kane's smile shifted, not disappearing, but reconfiguring itself, the pleasantness rearranging into something that was more comfortable being direct. I'm just saying there are people in this town who have concerns about the situation, about what kind of example it sets. He spread his hands in a gesture of pure reasonableness. I'm not one to judge, Cole, but people talk. And when people talk about a man's reputation, my reputation, Cole said, has never been your business. No, but the land on your western boundary has been something I'd like to discuss. Then discuss it through my attorney, the way you have every other time you've wanted to discuss it, and the answer will be the same it's always been. Cole looked at him steadily. And Rufus, the next time you decide to use a woman's name to create leverage in a business matter, I'll make sure every man in this county knows that's what you did. Kane's smile went away entirely. What replaced it was the look of a man recalculating, revising the terms of an equation that had just changed in a way he hadn't fully anticipated. Cole put his hat back on and walked away. He didn't feel righteous about it. He didn't feel particularly satisfied. He felt the way he generally felt after doing something that was clearly right. like a man who has moved a heavy thing into its correct position and is now simply aware that the thing is where it belongs. What he hadn't anticipated was the witness, Hatch, who had been waiting outside the feed merchant across the street and had seen the whole exchange, spread the story the way Hatch spread all information, efficiently, without embellishment, to exactly the people who needed to know it. By the following Sunday, the version of events that was circulating in Harlan County was a notably different one from the story Kane had been cultivating. A widow's virtue was still the subject, but the narrative had rotated on its axis. What people were talking about now was what Cole Brennan had said outside the bank. Several of the women who had been coolest toward Rebecca began, incrementally and without ever making explicit acknowledgement, to warm. Patrice Holbrook found a reason to be at the general store on a Tuesday when Rebecca was there, and found a reason to mention, somewhat stiffly, that she had heard the Brennan Ranch had been having a productive season. It was not an apology. It was not even close to an apology. But it was a signal, and Rebecca was fluent in the language of signals by now. She thanked Patrice politely for saying so, and she walked back to the ranch carrying her basket, and the 6 miles felt, somehow, like fewer than they had the week before. The summer stretched on, dry and relentless, as if the season itself was testing what was solid and what would crack. The ranch held together. Rebecca's routine settled into something that had stopped feeling temporary. The early mornings, the kitchen full of steam, and the smell of coffee. The ranch hands coming through with their easy, respectful acknowledgement, Hatch's dog tracking mud across the clean floor, the children scattered through the property like seeds finding their places in unfamiliar ground. Thomas had taken to riding with a seriousness that the older hands recognized and quietly encouraged, the way experienced men recognize the thing in a young person that will define them. Cole gave him more responsibility, gradually and without fanfare, and Thomas carried it the same way, without fanfare, without appearing to need acknowledgement, just absorbing each new task and doing it well and waiting to see what came next. Cole noticed that Thomas watched him. Not openly. The boy was too careful for that. But in the peripheral, constant way that children watch the adults who matter to them, learning something that isn't being formally taught. Cole wasn't sure what he was teaching. He tried to make sure it was worth learning. Clara, who had been silent for so long, bloomed in slow increments that Rebecca tracked privately, the way a mother tracks the things that have worried her, cataloging recoveries alongside losses. She started drawing, detailed, careful sketches of the horses and the barn cat and the hills to the east, done in charcoal on the brown paper she saved from the supply deliveries. She showed them to no one at first, but left them in places they might be found, which was its own kind of showing. Hatch found one, a drawing of his dog asleep by the cottage door, detailed down to the gray muzzle and the one paw that always curled under, and stuck it to the wall of the barn without saying anything about it. Clara pretended not to notice. Her next drawing was more detailed than the last. And Jesse, who had arrived at the Brennan Ranch pressing his fist against his stomach to dull the hurt. Jesse forgot, over the course of that summer, that his stomach had ever needed pressing. He followed Cole on weekend mornings with the faithful persistence of a shadow, asking questions at the rate of approximately 1 per minute and receiving answers with the solemnity of someone collecting important data. Cole had not expected this. He had not been prepared for the way a small boy's trust simply arrives, no negotiation required, no terms discussed, just there, one day like weather. He handled it carefully. He was aware, in a way that was new to him and somewhat uncomfortable, that careful handling was required. Rebecca watched all of this from the peripheral vision of a woman who is always watching, who has trained herself to notice the things that aren't being said out loud, because the things that aren't being said out loud are often the most important ones. She watched Thomas's shoulders unknot, degree by degree. She watched Clara emerge. She watched Jesse adopt Cole with the uncomplicated confidence of a 4-year-old who has decided that a person is safe. She watched Cole receive all of it, the trust and the noise and the relentless company of 5 children who had arrived at his property as a complication and were becoming, through no plan that anyone had made, something else entirely. She noticed, and she was careful about what she let herself feel about it, because careful was what she knew how to be. But at night, sitting on the cottage porch with her mending in her lap and the warm summer dark wrapped around everything, she sometimes thought about a woman standing at a fence post in the failing light, making a desperate promise into the empty air. She had promised to endure anything. She had not promised to stay guarded forever. She wasn't sure anymore that she could. The first sign was the smell. Rebecca noticed it before anyone else did, the way she noticed most things, quietly, without announcement, filing it away in the part of her mind that was always running a parallel inventory of the world around her. It was early evening, the sun still an hour above the horizon, but already going amber and thick, and she was standing at the kitchen window washing the last of the dinner dishes when the smell reached her. Not wood smoke exactly. Wood smoke was a familiar thing, a safe thing, the smell of hearths and cook fires, and the particular comfort of a house doing what houses were meant to do. This was something else, something older and more indiscriminate, the smell of things burning that were not meant to burn. She dried her hands on her apron and went to the door. To the southwest, the sky had changed color. Not the warm copper of a normal sunset, but something uglier. A bruised orange shot through with a darkness that moved, that shifted at its own edges, that was not the stillness of a cloud. She stood on the porch and looked at it for 3 full seconds, which was all the time she allowed herself before she turned back into the house and started moving. Thomas. Her voice was level. She had learned in the months since Daniel died, that level was the most important thing your voice could be in a crisis. Fear was contagious. Calm, if you could manufacture it convincingly enough, was also contagious. Thomas, come here right now. He appeared in the doorway from the back room, reading something, and took one look at her face and set the book down. Get your sisters and your brothers, she said. Get them dressed and get them to the yard. Don't explain, just move. He moved. She went back to the door and looked southwest again, and the darkness had grown. She could see it now. Not just the color, but the shape. The way the smoke was building and spreading, the way the bottom of it was lit from beneath by something that pulsed. The drought had baked the grassland to tinder for 3 months. She knew, in the efficient and terrifying way that her mind processed emergencies, exactly what that meant for how fast the fire would travel. She was already calculating wind direction when she heard Cole's voice from across the yard, calling to the ranch hands with a sharp urgency that told her he had seen it too. Cole had been at the south barn when the smell hit him. Not a gradual awareness, but a sudden one, the kind of certainty that doesn't require confirmation. He was out of the barn and looking southwest within seconds, and what he saw put ice in his chest despite the heat of the evening. The fire was moving northeast. Pushed by the dry wind that had been building since afternoon, pushed by 3 months of drought that had turned every blade of grass on the open range into something that wanted only a reason to ignite. At the speed it was traveling, he had maybe 40 minutes before it reached the outer fence line. The cottage was on the southwest side of the property. He understood this before he finished the thought and was already running. Hatch! The older man appeared from behind the water trough, face tilted southwest, reading the same sky Cole was reading. Get the men on the water pumps. Wet the south fence line and the barn roof. Start now. Already thinking it, Hatch said, and turned and started bellowing at the hands in that carrying voice of his that had once, reportedly, stopped a cattle stampede. Cole ran for the cottage. Rebecca was already in the yard when he got there. The children arranged behind her with the precision of someone who has run drills for disasters that hadn't happened yet. Thomas had Jessie on his hip, which freed Rebecca's hands. May was holding Eli's hand with a grip that had turned both their knuckles white. Clara was last out the door, Captain the one-eared cat tucked under her arm, with a firmness that suggested she had considered leaving him and decided against it. Cole arrived at a run and stopped in front of Rebecca and said, We need to move the children to the main house. Now. North side, stone foundation. It'll hold if the grass fire doesn't jump. The cottage, Rebecca said, is in the fire's path. He said it directly, no softening. We can fight for the outbuildings, but I need to know the children are out of the southwest quadrant first. She held his gaze for a moment. He could see her processing it, running her own calculations, checking his assessment against the sky. Then she nodded once. Lead, she said. He led. They moved across the yard in a tight group, Cole slightly ahead, Rebecca at the rear with her hand on May's shoulder, keeping her moving. The smoke smell was stronger now, thick enough to taste, and the southwestern horizon had gone from bruised orange to something that was plainly, unmistakably fire, the kind that doesn't negotiate. Jessie, on Thomas's hip, was wide-eyed but quiet, one hand locked around his brother's collar. He had learned in his 4 years that the time to be quiet was when the adults were running. Cole got them inside the main house and pointed Thomas toward the back hallway. "Stone wall on the north end. Take your brother and your sisters and stay there until someone comes for you." Thomas looked at him with 12-year-old eyes that were doing something much older than 12. "What about my mother?" "Your mother and I are going to fight the fire," Cole said. "I can help fight." "Thomas," Rebecca's voice steady as iron, "you have your job. Do it." He looked at her. He looked at Jesse, still on his hip, still trusting. He pressed his mouth into a line that was more Daniel Hartwell's face than Rebecca had been prepared to see, and he turned and took his brother and his sisters down the hall. Clara stopped at the hallway entrance and looked back at Rebecca. Her gray-green eyes, her mother's eyes, were frightened in the open, unguarded way that Clara almost never allowed herself to be frightened. "Mama," she said. "I'll be back," Rebecca said. "I promise." Clara turned and went. What followed was the longest 2 hours of Rebecca Hartwell's life, and she had already lived through hours that she had been certain would never be surpassed. Cole put her on the water line immediately. The ranch had a system of buckets and hand pumps that the hands were operating with practiced efficiency, and he slotted her in without ceremony or instruction beyond a brief demonstration, which she didn't need because she was already watching and had understood the rhythm before he finished showing her. She worked beside Hatch, who was the steadiest man she had ever seen in a crisis, quiet, unhurried in his movements despite the urgency, the kind of steady that is not the absence of fear, but is fear properly organized. The fire came over the southern ridge like a living thing. She had seen prairie fires before, or thought she had. Small ones, controlled burns, the kind of fire that behaved itself and stayed within understood limits. This was not that. This was the drought speaking in its most honest voice, saying plainly what 3 months of killing heat had made the land into. It came fast, faster than anything that large had a right to move, and it came with sound, a roaring that she had not expected, a deep, continuous rushing that was the sound of oxygen being consumed at a scale that made the ordinary world seem very small. The outer fence line caught first, then the dry grass along the south side of the property, the section that hadn't been irrigated in weeks because the creek was too low. The hands worked the wet line with everything they had, and Cole was everywhere, directing, adjusting, moving from point to point with a decisiveness that she found in some portion of her mind that was still capable of noticing things beyond the immediate emergency. Remarkable. He was not a man who panicked. He was a man who went, in crisis, to the clearest version of himself. "The cottage," she said to him when he came down the line. She didn't need to say more than that. He looked at her. His face was lit orange by the fire on the south side, his eyes steady above it. "The well between the cottage and the barn," he said. "If we can keep that wet, tell me what to do." He told her. She did it. She worked the pump until her arms stopped feeling like arms and became something more mechanical, something that simply continued because stopping was not a choice she had made. Hatch worked beside her, and she matched his rhythm, and the water went where it needed to go, and she did not let herself think about the cottage, about the mended curtains she had hung last week, about Clara's drawings pinned to the wall above the small desk, about the specific way the western light came through the windows in the late afternoon and made even the bare wooden floor look like something worth having. She did not let herself think about any of that, because thinking about it would slow her hands, and her hands could not slow. The fire reached the cottage at what she estimated was the 40-minute mark. She saw it happen. She was at the pump, and she saw the fire catch the porch roof. The dry cedar shingles that she had meant to mention to Cole had made a note of as a thing to address before winter, and she saw it go fast, the way things go when the conditions are exactly wrong. The porch was gone in under 2 minutes. The main structure held longer, the log walls resisting with the stubbornness of something that took years to build and does not surrender easily. She kept pumping. There was nothing else to do. It was Cole who saw the actual danger before she did, because Cole was moving and she was stationary, and because Cole had the particular spatial awareness of a man who has spent years knowing every inch of his own land. He came running from the east side of the barn with his face tight and said, "Rebecca!" The wind shifted. She looked up. The fire on the cottage had jumped. Not to the barn, which they had protected, but to the small outbuilding to the east, and from there it had caught a line of dry cedar brush that ran along the property's interior, and was moving toward the main house with a speed that made everything she had calculated about the fire's path suddenly and completely wrong. For 1 second, she stopped pumping. 1 second of pure white noise panic, the kind that doesn't produce sound but produces silence. Absolute silence inside the skull, the kind where your body understands before your mind does that something real is at stake. Her children were in the main house. She moved. Cole moved at the same time, which she registered peripherally, and the two of them ran across the yard toward the house with the fire at their backs, running in the particular way that people run when they have stopped calculating odds and have committed entirely to a single direction. She was ahead of him briefly, and then he was beside her, and then he was ahead of her, and she did not think about the fact that he was running toward her children with the same urgency she was running toward them, because the thought was too large for the moment, and the moment required everything. He hit the door first and threw it open, and they were both inside, both running for the north hallway, both calling the children's names before they had fully stopped moving. Thomas appeared in the hallway entrance with Jessie on his hip, and Eli and May behind him and Clara last, Captain still under her arm, and the relief that went through Rebecca at the sight of all 5 of them, intact, present, standing, was physical, was something she felt in her bones, not in her mind. The fire jumped, Cole said to Thomas, because he had understood, had seen it on Cole's face. We need to get everyone out to the north door and to the stone root cellar behind the house. It's fireproof. Understand? Yes, sir, Thomas said. His voice was steady. 12 years old, and his voice was steady. Go, Cole said. Thomas went. The children went with him. Rebecca started to follow, and Cole's hand caught her arm. Not grabbing, not pulling, just there, contact, a signal. The root cellar is safe, he said. Get them in, and then come back. Come back for what? She said. Because you and I are the ones who know this property well enough to fight this, and because Hatch has 2 hands and I'd rather have 4. She looked at him for 1 second that contained several things she didn't have language for. Go, she said. He went. She got the children to the root cellar. It was built into a low rise behind the house, stone-lined and solid, the door thick enough that when she pulled it shut behind the children, the sound of the fire became a distant thing, a rumor. Thomas had a lamp. She looked at all 5 of them in the lamplight, their faces, their hands, Jessie already asking a question, Clara with her jaw set and Captain pressed to her chest, and she said, You stay here. You do not open this door. You wait for me or for Mr. Brennan. Thomas, you're in charge. Thomas looked at her with those old eyes. I know, he said. She put her hand against his face for 1 brief second. Then she closed the door and ran back into the fire. The next 40 minutes were something she would never fully describe to anyone, not because the events were beyond description, but because the feeling underneath them was the kind of thing that loses its truth the moment you try to put it into words. She worked beside Cole and Hatch and the remaining hands on the line between the burning brush and the main house. And the work was the kind that strips away everything that is not immediately necessary. No past, no future, no weight of months of grief and worry and holding herself together in the dark. Only the water and the fire and the line between them, and the people on either side of her working with everything they had. At some point the wind shifted again, back to its original direction, which was a mercy. Or perhaps just the weather finally running out of cruelty for the evening. The fire on the east brush line began to lose its momentum, starved by the water they'd laid down and by the absence of new fuel beyond the wet zone. It didn't go out all at once. Fires never do. But it began, incrementally, to become something manageable, still dangerous, still present, but no longer the thing that was making every decision. Cole was the first to see it turn. He stopped moving for just a moment, reading the fire the way he read the land, with the full attention of someone who has spent his life being accountable to it, and then he let out a long, slow breath. It's turning, he said to no one in particular. Hatch, beside him, said, Yeah. They kept working for another 20 minutes, until the line was solid, and the fire had backed off enough that Hatch felt comfortable walking it with 2 of the hands, while Cole and Rebecca stepped back. Her arms were shaking. She hadn't noticed until she stopped using them. Her face felt like the inside of an oven. There was a burn on her left forearm, not serious, a graze, the kind that would blister and heal, that she also hadn't noticed until the adrenaline began to ebb. She stood at the edge of the cleared zone and looked at what was left. The cottage was gone. Not entirely. The walls were standing, or most of them, the log structure that had resisted going down until the very last. But the interior was ash, and the roof was open to the sky, and the porch where she had sat every evening with her mending was nothing but charred timber. The curtains she hadn't let herself think about were gone. Clara's drawings were gone. The small desk was gone. The beds, the children's things, the modest, careful accumulation of the months they had lived there, gone. She stood and looked at it and felt, not grief exactly, but the particular exhaustion of a person who has spent months building something inch by inch and has just watched an uncontrollable thing undo a portion of it in an evening. She was very tired. She was so tired that the emotion behind it barely had room to surface. She became aware, without turning around, that Cole was standing behind her, not close. He was giving her the distance, the way he had always been precise about distance, about the space between them and what it meant, but present. There. "I'm sorry," he said, "about the cottage." "It held as long as it could," she said. "That it did." A pause. "You and the children will move into the main house. There's room. It's not a question." She turned to look at him. His face was soot dark and there was a cut above his eyebrow that he hadn't mentioned, and his eyes were the specific kind of tired that comes after sustained fear, the body's accounting for what it just cost you. "That's a significant change to our arrangement," she said. "Yes," he said. "It is." She looked at him. He looked back. The fire crackled quietly at the edges of the cleared zone, diminishing. "I need to get my children out of the root cellar," she said. "I know," he said. "I'll come with you." Thomas opened the root cellar door before they reached it. He had heard them coming and had decided, in the way that Thomas made decisions, that the sound of their voices meant the worst was over. He emerged first, Jesse still on his hip, and scanned the smoke-hazed yard with that careful adult gaze, reading the situation. His eyes landed on the cottage. He was quiet for a moment. "Is everyone all right?" he said. Not the cottage, not their things, not the drawings or the beds or Captain's particular corner of the floor where he had always slept. Everyone all right? The question in the right order. "Everyone's all right," Rebecca said. May and Eli came out after Thomas, blinking in the dim evening light, smelling the smoke, and pressing close to Rebecca without being asked. Then Clara, still holding Captain, who had endured the root cellar with the offended dignity of a cat who has been through worse. Clara looked at the cottage. She looked at it for a long time, with a child's complete and unguarded attention, taking in the open roof and the dark walls and the absence of everything that had been inside. Her jaw was tight. She was 10 years old and she was not going to cry. Rebecca could see the decision being made in her daughter's face, the same face that had gone so quiet and so old after Daniel died, that was only now, finally, beginning to find its way back to itself. Rebecca crouched down and opened her arms, and Clara walked into them with the quick, decisive movement of someone who has decided that comfort is not weakness, who has decided that her mother's arms are a place she is allowed to go. She held her daughter and looked over her head at the ruined cottage and felt the weight of it and did not let it take her down. She had learned over months of practice how to hold the weight without being taken down. It was the thing she was best at, possibly. The thing she had built in herself out of necessity. The way the ranchers built windbreaks out of necessity, not because they wanted the work, but because the alternative was letting the wind take everything. Jesse from Thomas's hip said, "Is our house broken?" "Yes," Rebecca said honestly. "But we're going to stay in Mr. Brennan's house for now." Jesse looked at Cole with those gold-brown eyes, direct and serious. "In your big house?" "In my big house," Cole said. Jesse considered this. "Okay," he said, with the completeness of a 4-year-old's acceptance, the way they close the distance between disaster and adjustment in a single syllable, unburdened by all the intermediate steps that adults insist on agonizing through. Cole looked at Rebecca over Jesse's head. She was still crouching, Clara still in her arms, and she looked up at him from that position, and the exhaustion and the smoke and the residue of fear were all on her face at once, unguarded, because she didn't have anything left to guard with. He said quietly, "You came back." "You asked me to," she said. "I know. I'm saying you didn't have to. The children were safe. She understood what he meant. He was saying that she had come back to the fire not just because he'd asked, but because she had chosen to. Had chosen the ranch, the fight, the line between the fire and the house where her children were sheltering. Had chosen to stand in it with him. "This is my home," she said. The words came out before she had finished deciding to say them, before she had examined them for all the implications they carried. But she didn't take them back. She looked up at him and let them stand. Something moved through Cole Brennan's face that he had no name for. Something that had been living in the territory between what he understood about himself and what he was only beginning to discover. He stood in the smoke-hazy yard of his own ranch with this woman crouching in the ash-dusted grass and her 5 children arranged around them both, and the ruins of the cottage behind him and the main house solid and standing ahead. And he felt the future rearrange itself, quietly and without drama, into a shape he hadn't known he was waiting for. He didn't say anything. He reached down and offered Rebecca his hand. She looked at it for a moment. Then she took it, and he helped her up, and she didn't let go immediately, and neither did he. Around them, Hatch's dog found its way out of wherever it had been sheltering and shook itself and came to press against Thomas's leg. Captain extracted himself from Clara's grip and began investigating the changed landscape with a cat's imperious curiosity. May asked Eli if he was hungry, and Eli said yes, and May said she was too. Jesse asked if the horses were okay, and Cole said yes, the horses were fine, and Jesse said good because he liked the horses. Life doing what life does. Resuming, persisting, finding its way back to the ordinary through every crack in the extraordinary. Rebecca looked around at her children in the dim evening, making her private inventory, the one she had been making every day since April, in a rented house with nothing left in the pantry. 5 of them, all accounted for. She had stood at a fence post once and made a desperate promise in the dark, certain she was alone. She understood now, for the first time with her whole self, and not just the part that could reason about it, that she had not been alone that evening. She had not been alone for a long time. She was just now letting herself know it. Moving into the main house happened the way most necessary things happen. Not gradually, not with ceremony, but all at once. Because the alternative was sleeping in the yard and nobody was suggesting that. Cole cleared the east wing without being asked, which Rebecca noticed. He didn't make an announcement about it. Didn't sit down with her to discuss the logistics or the implications or the appearance of the thing. He simply appeared on the morning after the fire with Hatch and 2 of the younger hands, and by noon the east wing had been aired out and the beds made up, and a room designated for the girls and a room for the boys, and a small sitting room at the end of the hall that Rebecca understood, without being told, was meant for her, meant to be hers, a space with a door that closed, a place where she could be a person and not just a function. She stood in the doorway of that sitting room for a long moment before she went inside. It had a window that faced east, which meant morning light. There was a writing desk against the wall, and a chair that looked like it had not been sat in for years, and a small bookshelf with a gap where several volumes had been removed. Recently, she could see the outline of them in the dust. She thought about asking what had been there, and then decided it wasn't her business, and sat down in the chair and felt the particular strangeness of a room that was hers. She had not had a room of her own since before Thomas was born. She allowed herself exactly 3 minutes to sit in it. Then she got up and went back to work, because the household did not run itself, and because sitting too long with feelings she hadn't finished understanding was a habit she'd been trying to break for months. The children settled into the main house with the adaptability of people who have recently learned that home is less about a specific set of walls and more about the people inside them. Thomas chose the bed closest to the door in the boys' room, which Rebecca recognized as a choice made from protective instinct rather than preference. Closest to the door meant first to respond if something happened at night. She said nothing about it. Eli took the bed by the window because the window faced the barn, and he wanted to be able to see the horses first thing in the morning. Jesse climbed into the remaining bed and announced that it was the biggest bed he had ever slept in, which was probably true, and fell asleep in it fully dressed. Clara arranged her side of the girls' room with the methodical precision of a general establishing a command post. Her drawings, the ones she'd managed to rescue, rolled and tucked under her arm when they fled the cottage, were pinned above her bed within the first hour. Captain was installed on the windowsill by the second. By the third hour, Clara was drawing again. A new piece, charcoal on the brown paper she'd asked Rebecca for. and the subject was the fire. Not the destruction of it, not the fear, but the particular orange light it had cast on the yard, the way it had made everything look simultaneous with darkness and brightness. The drawing was the most technically accomplished thing she had ever made. Rebecca looked at it over her daughter's shoulder and didn't say anything, because there was nothing to say that the drawing wasn't already saying better. May, who had cried twice during the fire and not at all since, examined the girl's room with a practical eye and informed Clara that she thought Captain should sleep on May's side of the room because Clara's side was where the draft came in, and cats didn't like drafts. Clara told her, with measured disdain, that Captain slept where Captain decided to sleep, and that was not a matter subject to human negotiation. May considered this and said fair enough and went to find Eli and the rhythm of the household. This particular household, this specific and improbable arrangement of people, reasserted itself as if it had never been interrupted. It was ordinary. That was the thing that kept striking Rebecca about it. The ordinariness of children arguing about a cat, of boots on wooden floors, of someone asking what was for supper, and someone else saying they didn't know, but they hoped it was the cornbread with the molasses because that was the best kind. The fire had taken the cottage and everything in it, and the next morning these children were arguing about a cat. She thought, not for the first time, that children were the most resilient things in the world, and that the credit for this was entirely their own. The town found out about the fire within 2 days, which was about as long as it took for any significant event at the Brennan Ranch to make its way to Harlan County's collective awareness. The fire itself was not the interesting part. Prairie fires were a fact of life, and anyone who had lived in this part of Texas long enough had a story. The interesting part, to the town, was the part that came after. The widow and her 5 children moved into Cole Brennan's main house. Rufus Kane heard about it on a Tuesday. By Thursday he had done what Rufus Kane did with information, turned it over in his hands until he found the edge that was most useful, and then applied it with precision. He was not a man who made noise publicly if he could accomplish the same thing quietly. And his first move was not a speech or a confrontation, but a series of private conversations with the 3 members of Harlan County's informal council of opinion. Judge Alderman, who was Doris Alderman's husband and who considered himself the moral custodian of the community. Reverend Price, who held an analogous position in his own estimation. And Margaret Forsythe, who had been the county's social arbiter for 30 years, and whose approval or disapproval could make or break a reputation faster than any legal proceeding. Kane visited each of them separately in the space of a single afternoon, and the message he delivered to each was essentially the same, adjusted for the particular sensitivities of each recipient. To the judge, he framed it as a matter of propriety and legal standing. Questions about what arrangements were being made, whether proper formalities had been observed, whether the county had any interest in ensuring things were conducted correctly. To the Reverend, he spoke of community standards and the importance of example. To Margaret Forsythe, he said almost nothing explicit at all, which was the most effective approach with Margaret, because Margaret Forsythe did her best work when she was allowed to draw her own conclusions. He was back in his office by 4 o'clock, which left him time for a satisfying supper. What he had not anticipated, what Rufus Kane never quite managed to factor into his calculations, despite a lifetime of working with people, because it required a quality he did not himself possess, was the fire itself. Not the fire as a property event, not the fire as a logistical complication, but the fire as a story. As a thing that had happened in front of witnesses, that had produced a set of observable facts that were considerably more difficult to reshape than rumors. Hatch was one of the witnesses. Hatch, who did not gossip, who communicated only what was necessary, who had worked for Cole Brennan for 11 years with the steady loyalty of a man who has found his right place and knows it, Hatch had watched 2 people run through smoke and fire toward a root cellar full of children, and he had his own opinion about what that meant. And when people in town began to ask him about the situation at the ranch, he told them, not everything. Hatch was constitutionally incapable of telling everything, but the specific things he chose to tell were carefully selected and precisely placed, the way you place stones when you're building something meant to last. He told Marta Gillies at the dry goods store, who had known Cole since he first came to the county with nothing but the clothes on his back and the intention of building something, that Rebecca Hartwell had worked the water line through the fire without stopping, without complaint, with more endurance than most of the paid hands had managed. He told it as a plain fact, no decoration. Marta Gillies was a woman who valued plain facts. She filed it accordingly. He told Pete Dunmore at the feed merchant that young Thomas Hartwell, 12 years old, had kept 4 children calm in a root cellar during a prairie fire and had opened the door at exactly the right moment because he had been listening for the sound of voices he trusted. Pete Dunmore had 3 sons of his own and understood exactly what that said about how a boy had been raised. He told the story of Jesse asking if the horses were all right, which seemed like a small thing, but which spread through the town like a different kind of fire, warm instead of consuming, the kind that makes people feel something without knowing exactly why. None of these were arguments. Hatch was not making arguments. He was simply placing the facts where they could be found by people who might be looking for them. The community meeting was not Kane's idea, which was the first miscalculation he had made in the affair. It was Judge Alderman's, called, the judge said, in the interest of clarity, to address community concerns in a proper and organized fashion. Cole was informed of it by a note delivered to the ranch on a Friday morning, 3 sentences long, formal and neutral in tone. He read it twice. Then he folded it and put it in his coat pocket and went to find Rebecca. She was in the kitchen. She was almost always in the kitchen at that hour, the center of the house's functioning, the place where she was most completely herself. She was making bread, which she did by hand because she found the work calming, the rhythmic pressure of it, something to do with the body while the mind sorted through whatever needed sorting. She looked up when Cole came in and read his face with that quick gray-green precision of hers and said, "What is it?" He gave her the note. She read it. She set it on the counter and turned back to the bread and worked it for a moment without speaking. "They want to make it formal," she said. "Kane pushed for it," Cole said. "Or he pushed someone else to push for it. Same thing. Are you going to go?" "Yes." She looked at him. "You don't have to defend yourself to that meeting, Cole. You haven't done anything that requires defense." It was the first time she had used his given name. They both heard it. She didn't look away, and neither did he, and neither of them addressed it because the moment had too many other things in it already. "I'm not going to defend myself," he said. "I'm going to tell the truth. Those are different things." She was quiet for a moment. The bread dough was still under her hands, patient and inert. What truth? He thought about how to answer that. He had been thinking about it, in the particular persistent way he thought about important things, since the evening of the fire, since the moment she had taken his hand in the smoke-hazed yard and said, "This is my home," with the voice of a person who doesn't say things they don't mean. "The one that's actually there," he said, "instead of the one Kane built." She looked at him for a long moment, then she turned back to the bread. "I want to come," she said. "Rebecca, I'm not going to sit in this house and let other people speak about my character in a room I'm not in." Her voice was level, not angry, level, which in Rebecca Hartwell was a more serious thing than anger. "I have been letting other people speak about my character in rooms I wasn't in for 4 months. I'm done with that." He stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at her and thought about saying something cautionary, about how it might be harder, being there, being the subject of a room's attention. He thought about it and then discarded it, because she already knew, and because telling her things she already knew was not a form of respect. "All right," he said, "we'll go together." The meeting was held in the county assembly hall on a Tuesday evening, which gave the town 5 days to prepare its positions. The hall was a long, plain room with wooden benches arranged in rows and an elevated platform at the front where Judge Alderman would sit with Reverend Price and Margaret Forsyth on either side, completing the informal tribunal with all the authority of people who have never had their authority formally granted, but have never had it successfully disputed either. Cole and Rebecca arrived together, which was itself a statement. She had dressed carefully. Not elaborately. She had nothing elaborate to dress in, but with the particular care of a woman who understands that appearance is a language and intends to be fluent. Her dress was clean and pressed, her hair done simply, her expression arranged into the version of herself that she wore when she was prepared to withstand whatever came. Thomas had asked to come. Rebecca had told him no, firmly, and without extensive explanation. And Thomas had stood in the hallway of the main house with that 12-year-old dignity of his and said, "Is it about us?" And Rebecca had said yes, and he had said, "Then you should tell them the truth about us." And Rebecca had said, "That is exactly what I intend to do." And Thomas had nodded as if this settled the matter. The hall was nearly full when they walked in. People who had been talking stopped talking. People who had been looking elsewhere found reasons to look at the door. Cole registered all of this with the peripheral awareness of a man who was accustomed to rooms reading him, and he kept his face neutral and his stride even and his hand, briefly, at the small of Rebecca's back. A point of contact, nothing more, just the physical acknowledgement that they had come here together and would leave together, and the room could draw whatever conclusions it chose. Hatch was in the back row. He gave Cole a single nod. Cole returned it. Rufus Kane was in the front row, slightly to the side, positioned where he could watch the room without being its center. He was wearing his good coat. He looked, as he always looked, like a man who has already decided how this will end. Judge Alderman opened the proceedings with the deliberate solemnity of a man who enjoys the weight of his own voice. He spoke of community standards and the responsibilities of county citizens to one another, and the importance of addressing concerns in a proper form rather than through rumor and speculation, which was mildly ironic given that it was rumor and speculation that had produced the form in the first place. He spoke for approximately 8 minutes. Then he invited community members to speak their concerns. 3 people spoke before Kane. The first 2 were women, acquaintances of Patrice Holbrook, people who had absorbed the story in its cane-shaped version and repeated the important parts of it back in slightly different arrangements, the way people do when they are certain of something they have not personally witnessed. They spoke of propriety, of what was right, of the importance of setting an example for the county's children. Their voices were earnest. They were not bad people. They were people who had received bad information and had done nothing to verify it, which is a failure of a different kind, but still a failure. The third person was a man named Gerald Marsh, who owned the property north of town and who had a reputation for bluntness that occasionally made him difficult to be around and occasionally made him the most useful person in a room. He stood up and said, "I'd like to know what exactly people think is happening out at the Brennan ranch that requires this meeting, because I've heard 6 different versions and none of them agree." This produced a significant amount of murmuring. Then Rufus Kane stood up. He was smooth. Cole had to give him that. He began by emphasizing, with apparent sincerity, that he bore no ill will toward anyone, toward Mrs. Hartwell, toward Cole, toward the children, none of them. He framed himself as a concerned citizen, a man who had the community's interest at heart, a man who asked only that things be conducted in a fashion that the county could be proud of. He used the word propriety 4 times, and the word concern 7 times, and the phrase for everyone's sake twice, and each time it landed with the practiced ease of a man who has learned that the most effective attacks are the ones that don't look like attacks. He had been speaking for perhaps 3 minutes when Cole stood up. Kane paused. The room went the specific kind of quiet that happens when a person who doesn't usually speak in public spaces rises to speak. The quiet of collective recalibration, of people putting down their expectations and picking up their attention. Cole did not look at Kane. He looked at the room, at the people he had lived among for 12 years, at faces he recognized and faces that were newer, at Judge Alderman on the platform and Margaret Forsyth with her careful expression and Reverend Price, who had the look of a man who is hoping for the best but has stopped expecting it. "I'll keep this short," Cole said. He had a voice that carried without effort, the voice of a man accustomed to giving orders across open land. Because the truth doesn't take long, and everything that isn't the truth takes longer than it's worth. The room was still. Rebecca Hartwell came to work on my ranch in July because I asked her to, because my ranch needed managing, and she was the best person I had encountered in 12 years of looking, and because her children were hungry, and I had food, and there was no sensible reason not to make that offer. He paused. She has been employed on that ranch, drawing wages, doing work that is worth more than I'm paying for it, since the day she arrived. She lives in my house because the cottage she was living in burned down in a fire that was no one's fault, and because I am not the kind of man who puts a woman and 5 children in a yard because their housing inconveniently caught fire. He looked at Kane then, just for a moment. That's the situation. Those are the facts. What's been said around this county about Rebecca Hartwell's character is not the facts. It is a story that someone with an interest in my property has found useful, and I want every person in this room to understand that clearly, because you deserve to know when you're being used as a tool. The murmuring had changed character. It was no longer the murmuring of a crowd processing something it had been prepared to believe. It was something less comfortable, something that contained the particular friction of people revising. Judge Alderman started to speak. Rebecca stood up. The judge stopped. She had not planned what she was going to say exactly. She had thought about it, on the ride over, the way she thought about difficult things. Not scripting it, but identifying the center of it, the thing she most needed to say, and trusting that the words would arrange themselves around that center when the time came. She stood in the assembly hall of Harlan County with the eyes of 300 people on her, and she felt, underneath the exposure of it, something solid. The thing she had built in herself over a year of loss and work and refusing to break. It held. "My husband died in April," she said. "His name was Daniel Hartwell. He was 34 years old and he was a good man. He left me with 5 children and not enough to live on, because he died too young and too fast, and because that is the kind of thing that happens to people, and there is nothing shameful about it. There's nothing shameful about a woman doing whatever work she can find to keep her children fed. There's nothing shameful about accepting a fair offer of fair employment from a man who runs an honest operation." Her voice was level. It was the most level it had ever been. "I have worked for every meal my children have eaten since I came to this county. I have asked nothing from anyone that I was not prepared to earn. What has been said about me in this community is false, and the people who said it knew it was false when they said it, and I think most of the people in this room, if they examine what they actually know against what they were told, will find that they knew it too." She looked at Kane. She gave him the full weight of her gray-green eyes. "I don't know what Mr. Kane wants from Cole Brennan's land," she said, "but I know that I am not going to be the means by which he gets it." The silence was complete. Then, from the back of the room, Gerald Marsh started to clap. It was slow at first, single, deliberate claps, the kind that are not enthusiasm, but endorsement, the kind that say, "I have decided." And then Hatch joined him, and then Pete Dunmore from the feed merchant, and then Marta Gillies, and then a dozen people, 2 dozen, the applause finding its shape in the room the way water finds its level. Rufus Kane sat very still in the front row. Judge Alderman looked at him, and then at Rebecca, and then at Cole, and then he looked at his hands for a moment with the expression of a man who has just understood something he should have understood earlier and is deciding how to proceed with dignity and tact. "I think," the judge said, "that the concerns raised this evening have been satisfactorily addressed." It was not an apology. It was never going to be an apology. That was not a thing that assemblies like this produced. But it was a closing, and it was decisive, and Rufus Kane left the hall without speaking to anyone, which everyone present understood as the clearest verdict the evening had delivered. They rode back to the ranch in near silence, which was not an uncomfortable silence. Cole drove and Rebecca sat beside him on the wagon seat, and the Texas night spread out around them, wide and dark and cool, in the way that only late summer nights manage, as if the season is briefly remembering that it knows how to be kind. After a mile or so, Rebecca said, "You didn't have to do that." "I know," Cole said. "What you said about me in there. You put your standing in front of people you've to live beside for the rest of your life." "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. "Why?" He thought about the various ways to answer that. The practical answer, the logical answer, the one that stayed on the surface of things and was true as far as it went. He had learned over the past months that Rebecca Hartwell deserved better than the surface of things. "Because it was true," he said, "and because you earned it, and because—" He paused. "Because I'm tired of being the kind of man who knows what the right thing is and calculates how much it costs him before he decides whether to do it." She turned to look at him. He kept his eyes on the road, on the horses moving steadily in the dark. "That's a significant thing to say," she said. "I know that," he said. The wagon moved through the dark, the horses finding their way home by the particular intelligence of animals that have made this journey many times. The ranch lights appeared ahead. The main house lit at the windows, warm and solid against the night sky. "Thomas will be awake," Rebecca said. "I'd be surprised if any of them were asleep," Cole said. She almost smiled. He saw it in his peripheral vision, not the full smile, not yet, but the beginning of one, the shape of what a smile was preparing to be. "Cole?" she said. Thank you." He was quiet for a moment, holding the reins, feeling the familiar weight of the horse's pull, the familiar approach of home. "You thanked me the first week," he said. "In the kitchen. I told you that's what I was paying you for." "I know," she said. "This is different. He looked at her then, briefly, before turning back to the road. In the darkness, her face was the color of something quiet and decided. "Yes," he said. "It is." The wagon rolled through the gate. The ranch house stood ahead of them, lit and solid and full of children, full of the sounds that a house makes when it has people living inside it who belong there. Cole brought the horses to a stop by the barn and set the brake and climbed down and offered his hand, and she took it, and this time when her feet were on the ground, she didn't immediately let go. They stood for a moment in the yard in the dark, her hand in his, both of them looking at the lit windows of the house where her children were waiting and not waiting, where a 12-year-old boy was probably listening for the sound of the wagon wheels, and a 10-year-old girl was probably drawing in the lamplight, and twin 7-year-olds were probably asleep in defiance of expectation, and a 4-year-old boy with gold-brown eyes was pressed into a pillow that smelled like cedar and safety. Cole looked down at her hand in his. He had held it twice now. Each time it had been in the context of a crisis, a need, a practical moment with too many other things in it. This moment had nothing else in it. "Rebecca," he said. "Don't say anything careful," she said. He closed his hand around hers. "All right," he said. "I won't." The night held them there for a while longer, quiet and vast and indifferent in the way that good nights are. Not watching, not approving or disapproving, just present, just the stars and the cooling air and the smell of the land after a long summer, doing what the world does while people figure out what they mean to each other. The horses shifted in the traces. Inside the house, a lamp moved from one room to another, Thomas doing his final check of the night. Neither of them spoke for a long while. Neither of them needed to. The morning after the assembly hall had a quality that Rebecca hadn't experienced in so long, she almost didn't recognize it. She woke before the sun, the way she always did, and lay still for a moment in the dark of her room, with its east-facing window and its writing desk and the chair that had begun to hold the shape of her, and felt the house around her, not the cautious, provisional feeling of a house that might be taken away. Something older and more solid than that, the feeling of a structure that had decided at some point in the night that you belonged inside it. She got up and went to the kitchen. Cole was already there. This had happened before, their schedules converging in the early morning dark, both of them creatures of first light and early rising. But it had always been accompanied by the particular careful courtesy of two people maintaining the terms of an arrangement. This morning was different. Something in the way they occupied the same space had shifted, had lost its tentativeness, the way a conversation shifts after the important thing has finally been said out loud. He poured her coffee without being asked and set it at the end of the counter where she always stood, and she took it without making anything of the gesture, and they stood in the kitchen in the pre-dawn quiet, and neither of them spoke for a while, and it was entirely comfortable. "Thomas was awake when we got back," Cole said eventually. "I know. I could hear him. He didn't come out." "No." She wrapped both hands around the cup. "He decided we didn't need him to." Cole looked at her. "That's a significant decision for a 12-year-old. "Thomas makes significant decisions constantly," she said. "He just makes them quietly." Cole thought about this. The kitchen was beginning to gray toward dawn, the first light coming through the east window in the specific way that it did at this hour. Not color yet, just the suggestion of color, the world remembering what it was. "He's going to be someone remarkable," Cole said. "He already is," Rebecca said. "He's been remarkable since the week after his father died. I just need the world to slow down enough to let him be 12 for a while first." Cole looked at his cup. "I can give him that," he said. "Here, the work is real, and the responsibility is real, but it's not weight he has to carry instead of you. It can just be what a boy does on a ranch." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You've been thinking about them. The children. Separately. Individually." It wasn't a question, but he answered it anyway. "Yes." "For how long?" He considered being evasive and discarded it. "Since about the 3rd week," he said, "when I saw Eli name every horse in the barn in the correct order after being told once." She smiled then. The full one, the one he had been catching the edges of for months. It transformed her face in the way that a person's real smile always does, showing the version of them that exists underneath the version they show the world. He has a memory like a steel trap, she said. Always has. Even as a baby. You'd say a word once and he'd have it. And May? May will run something someday. A business or a household or a small country. I haven't determined which yet. She's been organizing people since she could walk. And Clara? Rebecca's expression did something tender. Clara sees the world differently than other people. She always has. She looks at things and she sees what they actually are, not what you'd expect them to be. A pause. Her drawings. Have you seen what she's been doing lately? The one on the barn wall, Cole said. Hatch told her she could use that corner. She showed me last week. She's drawing the ranch piece by piece, every corner of it. She says she wants to know it completely before she draws it all together. Rebecca looked at her cup. She's been doing that since she was small, learning things in pieces before she'll commit to the whole. She did it with reading, with people, with every place we've ever lived. A pause that had weight in it. She hasn't done it in a long time. She stopped after Daniel. There wasn't a place worth learning completely. Cole was quiet for a moment. And she's doing it now. She's doing it now, Rebecca said. The sun came up. It arrived through the east window in a long shaft that crossed the kitchen floor and reached the far wall. And the kitchen went from gray to gold, and the day became official. And from somewhere in the back of the house, they heard the particular sequence of sounds that meant the household was waking. A door, small feet, Jesse's voice asking something in the vague and unanswerable way of 4-year-olds not fully separated from sleep. Rebecca set down her cup and moved toward the stove, and Cole stepped back to give her room, and the kitchen filled with the sounds and smells of morning, and whatever the night had settled between them settled a little further into permanence. Rufus Kane made one more move. It came 2 weeks after the assembly hall, and it came in the form of a legal document, a formal complaint filed with the county recorder's office, citing an obscure land ordinance that Kane had apparently been researching for some time, arguing that the fire damage to the cottage constituted a structural liability that obligated the landowner to either rebuild or vacate the adjacent property line. It was, as Cole's attorney explained when he rode out to the ranch with the document, largely without merit. The ordinance Kane was citing had been written in 1861 for an entirely different set of circumstances, and had not been successfully applied in court in 20 years. He knows it won't hold, the attorney said. His name was Everett Cole, no relation, a lean, thoughtful man in his 60s who had been handling Brennan ranch business for a decade. He's not filing it because he expects to win. He's filing it because it requires a response, because it puts your name on a document in the county recorder's office, because it costs you time and money and attention. He's burning the brush, Cole said. Everett raised an eyebrow. Trying to drive something into the open, Cole said. Make me move in a direction he's chosen. That's one way to read it. Everett set the document on the desk. The other reading is that he's running out of moves and he knows it, and this is what the end of a bad hand looks like. Cole looked at the document, thought about Rufus Kane in his good coat, with his framed maps and his red pencil and his very careful smile. Thought about a woman standing at a fence post in the dark, making promises nobody thought anyone heard. Draft a response, Cole said. And while you're here, I need to discuss something else. Everett waited. I want to rebuild the cottage, Cole said. But not as a cottage. I want to expand it, make it a proper structure. 3 bedrooms, a real kitchen, a porch that runs the full south side. Use the original foundation and build up from it. He paused. And I want to add the western parcel to the deeded property. Put it in writing that it's part of the ranch in perpetuity, not subject to sale or separate transaction. Everett looked at him for a long moment, with the particular expression of a man who has known someone a long time and is watching them become something they have always been heading toward. That's a significant commitment of resources, he said. Yes, Cole said. It is. Is this about Kane? Locking down the parcel before he can maneuver for it? Partly, Cole said. And partly it's about building something that lasts. Everett nodded slowly. He picked up his pen. I'll need a few days to draft the parcel documentation. The response to Kane's complaint I can have ready by Friday. Friday's fine, Cole said. He walked Everett to his horse and then stood in the yard for a moment, looking at the charred outline of the cottage's remains. The walls had been cleared by the hands 2 weeks ago, the debris hauled away, the foundation left clean and open like a question waiting for its answer. He looked at it for a long time, reading the space the way he read land, seeing not what was there, but what could be there, the shape of the thing underneath the absence of it. He went to find Thomas. He located the boy at the south fence, doing the same inspection work Cole had been doing the evening he overheard Rebecca's promise at the fence post, a fact that registered with the particular quiet irony of things that come full circle. Thomas was working methodically, the way he did everything, testing each post and noting the ones that needed attention in the small journal he'd taken to carrying. Cole fell into step beside him. They worked in silence for a few posts, Thomas doing his assessment and Cole doing a secondary check behind him, which was not strictly necessary, but which established a rhythm between them. After a while, Cole said, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to understand that whatever you say is the honest answer, and it won't change anything between you and me." Thomas stopped walking. He turned and looked at Cole with those 12-year-old eyes that weren't entirely 12. "All right," he said. "How would you feel," Cole said, "about this being a permanent arrangement, not employment, not temporary housing, a permanent arrangement for your family?" The boy was very still. Cole could see him processing it, not the words which were simple enough, but the shape of what they meant, the full weight of what was being proposed, and what it would require and what it would change. "You mean the ranch," Thomas said. "I mean the ranch, and the family that would come with it, if everyone was willing." A pause. "I'm asking you first because you're the man of your family and you deserve to be asked first." Something moved through Thomas's face that Cole recognized from the assembly hall, from the root cellar, from every moment he had watched this boy make the decision to hold. That particular tightening that preceded something being felt fully and consciously instead of just endured. His jaw worked for a moment. "My father," he started. "I know," Cole said. "I'm not asking you to forget him or replace him. I wouldn't ask that. I don't think it's possible, and I don't think it's right." He looked at the boy steadily. "Your father was your father. That doesn't change. What I'm asking is whether there's room, whether you think there might be room, for something new. Alongside that, not instead of it." Thomas looked out at the land, the Brennan land, 1,800 acres of it, stretching south and east under the late summer sky. He had spent weeks on this land now. He had learned its rhythms and its moods, the places where the fence needed constant attention and the places where it held, the horses that wanted a soft hand and the ones that needed more firmness, the way the weather came from the northwest in the afternoon and what it meant for the next day's work. He had not learned it the way a visitor learns a place. He had learned it the way you learn a thing you intend to keep. "Claire's already decided," he said. Cole waited. "She's been drawing it," Thomas said. "All of it. Every corner of it. She doesn't do that unless she's already decided something is worth knowing permanently." He looked back at Cole. "Eli knows where every horse sleeps. May has already reorganized the supply closet twice, and she's planning a third time. Jesse calls the big bay horse his horse, which I'm pretty sure you know about." "I know about it," Cole said. "His horse is doing fine." Thomas almost smiled. It was so close to smiling that it counted. He looked down at his journal, at the notes he'd been making in his careful handwriting, and then he looked back up. "My mother," he said. "You'd have to ask her." "I'm going to," Cole said, "but I wanted to ask you first." Thomas was quiet for one more moment. Then he held out his hand. Not a boy's gesture, not the tentative offering of someone who isn't sure of the response, but the hand of a person who has made a decision and is marking it. Cole took it and shook it, and the handshake was brief and solid and meant something that neither of them tried to put into words. Thomas turned back to the fence. "Post 14 needs replacing," he said. "The wood's gone soft at the base." "I'll get Hatch to pull it tomorrow," Cole said. They kept walking. He asked Rebecca on a Sunday evening in early September, when the drought had finally broken and the sky had spent 3 days delivering the rain that the land had been owed since June. The children were inside, Eli and May at the kitchen table with a geography book they'd been arguing over companionably for an hour, Clara in her room with Captain and her charcoal, Jesse asleep at the unreasonably early hour of 6:30 with the completeness of someone who has spent the entire day running. Thomas had taken himself to the barn to check on the horses in the rain, which both of them understood as Thomas giving them the house. They sat on the covered porch of the main house and listened to the rain on the roof. The particular luxury of rain after a drought, The way it sounds like an apology and a promise simultaneously, and Rebecca had her mending in her lap and wasn't doing it, and Cole had his coffee and wasn't drinking it, and the comfortable silence between them had developed over the past weeks into something that felt less like silence and more like conversation conducted at a frequency below words. I had Everett draw up the parcel documentation, Cole said, for the western land. I'm keeping it deeded to the ranch permanently. To block Kane, she said. Among other reasons. She looked at him. What other reasons? He set down his coffee and turned to face her. He had thought about how to do this many times over the past weeks, had considered various approaches, various framings, various ways of managing the vulnerability of it. He had ultimately concluded that the only honest approach was the direct one. Rebecca Hartwell had no patience for the circuitous path, and after everything they had been through together, she deserved better than management. I'm building the cottage back, he said. Not a cottage, a proper house, on the original foundation. 3 bedrooms, a full kitchen, a porch. He paused. I had something different in mind for it than housing, if you're willing to hear what that is. She was very still. I want to deed it to you, he said. The house and the parcel it sits on. Your name on the document. Yours and no one else's. Not as part of any employment arrangement, not contingent on anything. Just property. In your name, that no one can take from you regardless of what happens. He held her gaze. Your children would have a home that belongs to them. That's theirs. That you can give them. She looked at him for a long time. He could see her doing what she always did with large things, turning them over, examining the edges, finding where the weight was distributed. He waited. That's not all of it, she said. What you want to say? No, he said. It's not. The rain came down steadily, and the porch held it off, and the lamplight from inside the house made everything amber and warm. From somewhere inside he could hear Clara's voice. She had started singing again, the same made-up songs she'd sung as a smaller girl, the ones she'd stopped after Daniel died and had been recovering note by note for months. I have spent 12 years, Cole said, building something I couldn't name. I told myself it was the ranch. It is the ranch. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. It's real, and it matters to me. But it was also something I was building toward without knowing what I was building toward. He looked at his hands for a moment, those ranchers' hands, the hands that had worked this land into what it was. I know now. It's been here since July, getting clearer every day, and I've been honest enough with myself to see it even if I wasn't ready to say it. Cole, she said, gentle the way she said it, warning and permission in the same word. I love you, he said. I love your children. I want to give Thomas the room to be 12, and I want to watch Eli name every horse on this ranch, and I want Clara to draw every corner of it until she knows it the way she needs to know things. And I want May to reorganize my supply closet as many times as she considers necessary. Something shifted in his face. Something cracked open that he'd been keeping closed for a very long time. And I want Jesse to keep calling that bay horse his horse, because it is his horse. It's been his horse since the second morning. The horse just doesn't know the paperwork is pending. She made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and something that wasn't a laugh, and pressed her hand over her mouth, and her eyes were doing something that she was controlling carefully. That's a significant thing to say, she said. It was what she had said the night of the assembly hall, almost the exact same words, and he recognized them, and she knew he recognized them. I know it is, he said. She was quiet for a long moment. The rain kept coming, and Clara kept singing, and the porch held, and the lamp burned inside, and the world continued to be what it was, indifferent to the size of the moment happening on its surface. Daniel was the first person who made me feel like myself, she said. Her voice was even, which he understood as the same mechanism it had always been. Not absence of feeling, but feeling handled with both hands. Not the version of myself I was supposed to be. The actual one. She looked at the rain. I didn't know if I'd ever have that again. I thought maybe it was a thing that happened once, if you were lucky, and you kept the memory of it, and that was what you had. And? He said. She turned to look at him, those gray-green eyes, the color of weather deciding what to do. You see me, she said. Not who you needed me to be when you offered me the job. Not who the town decided I was. Not the widow or the mother or the problem or the arrangement. She held his gaze. You see the actual one. Yes, he said. I didn't expect that, she said. I had stopped expecting that. I know. She set down the mending she hadn't been doing and turned to face him completely, the way she had never quite fully turned toward him before, the last careful degree of turning that had been waiting for exactly this moment. I love you too, she said. I've known it for longer than I was ready to say it. He reached across the space between them and took her hand. She let him, completely this time, without the qualification of crisis or the parentheses of emergency. Just her hand in his, in the lamplight, in the rain. Neither of them said anything for a while. They didn't need to. They married in October, when the rains had turned the land green again and the drought's long damage was beginning to be repaired, inch by stubborn inch, the way the land always repairs itself. Without drama, without announcement, just the persistent work of growing things doing what growing things do when given half a chance. The wedding was small, which was what both of them wanted. Everett drew up the documents. Hatch was Cole's witness, and Thomas was Rebecca's, which he received with the same careful dignity he received everything important, standing straight, saying what was required, pressing his mouth into the line that was so much his father's face that Rebecca had to look slightly away for a moment and back. The children had opinions about all of it. Eli wanted to know if the horses would know anything was different. May had strong views on the arrangement of the front room that she communicated to anyone who would listen and several people who wouldn't. Clara gave them a drawing. The two of them, done from memory, standing in the yard the night of the fire, their figures lit orange from behind, the main house solid and lit in the distance. It was, without question, the best thing she had ever made. Rebecca framed it and put it on the wall of the sitting room that had always been hers and now was in a house that was officially, permanently, undeniably hers. Jessie asked, the morning of the wedding, if this meant that Cole was his papa now. The question landed in the kitchen with the weight that only a 4-year-old can achieve, complete, undefended, delivered with those gold-brown eyes asking it straight. Cole crouched down to Jessie's level, the way he had crouched down that first morning at the gate. The gesture that had become one of the things Rebecca loved about him, without ever deciding to. He looked at Jessie for a moment. If you want me to be, Cole said, that's your choice to make. Jessie considered this with the solemnity of someone taking a vote very seriously. Okay, Jessie said, you can be my papa, but you have to keep teaching me about the horses. That's a fair condition, Cole said. Jessie nodded, satisfied, and went back to his breakfast. Cole stood up. His face was doing something he was not entirely controlling, and Rebecca, who had been watching from the stove, decided to look out the window for a moment and give him the privacy of it. The cottage was finished before winter. Cole had been true to his word. 3 bedrooms, a full kitchen, a porch that ran the full south side. Built on the original foundation, but taller, wider, more permanent. The wood was good wood, properly cured, and the roof was cedar shingles that had been treated before installation, and the windows faced the directions that made the most of the light at different times of day. It was a house built by someone who had paid attention to how the people inside it lived. Rebecca walked through it on the morning it was completed, the way she had walked through the original cottage that first day Cole had shown it to her, slowly, touching the windowsills, testing the floorboards. She stood in the center of the main room and looked at the light and the walls and the proportions of everything, and she felt the same thing she had felt the first time, but different now. Not the fragile, provisional feeling of a woman who needs something to be solid and is afraid to test how solid it actually is. Something more like recognition, something like arriving. The deed to the house and the parcel was on the writing desk in her sitting room in the main house, with her name on it in Everett's careful hand. It had been there for 3 weeks, and she had not moved it, because she found that she liked looking at it. The simple fact of it, her name on a piece of land in a county that had tried, for a period of months, to decide what kind of woman she was. They had decided wrong. She had corrected the record, with Cole beside her and the truth in her hands, and the particular backbone that 12 months of refusing to break had built into her down to the cellular level. Her name was on a deed. Her children were safe. Her husband, that word, still new, still carrying the weight of what it meant, was standing on the porch of the rebuilt cottage, talking to Thomas about the spring fence work. The two of them already planning the next season with the practical, unsentimental confidence of people who intend to be somewhere long enough to plan. She stood in the doorway and watched them. Cole with one boot on the bottom porch rail, Thomas beside him with his journal, and between them the easy shorthand of two people who have already learned each other's habits. Cole pointing south, and Thomas noting something and Cole nodding. The conversation moving at the pace of things that don't need to be hurried because there's time. Because there will be time. Because they are not going anywhere. Eli appeared from the direction of the barn at a run, shouting something about the bay mare, which Jesse, following at the run with his arms out for balance, 4 years old and fully committed, was apparently attempting to ride bareback with the fearless confidence of someone whose understanding of consequences had not yet caught up with his ambitions. Cole was off the porch and moving before the sentence was finished, with Thomas a step behind him, both of them not quite running but definitely walking very fast in the particular purposeful way of people who know better than to telegraph alarm to the horse. Rebecca watched this and felt something move through her that she had no name for, except perhaps this: the recognition of a life that was actually, genuinely, fully happening. Not a life being managed or endured or survived, a life being lived. She had made a promise in the dark at a fence post. She had promised to endure any hardship, sacrifice anything, do whatever it took. And she had. She had endured things she had not been certain she could endure. She had sacrificed the comfort of her pride and the safety of her solitude and the simpler story of a woman who needed nothing and asked for less. What she had not known, standing at that fence post in the failing summer light, what she could not have known, because some things only reveal themselves in the living of them, was that the endurance was not the point. The endurance was the path. And the path had led here, to this particular morning in October, with the smell of turned earth after rain and the sound of a 4-year-old being firmly redirected from bareback equestrian ambitions, and a 10-year-old somewhere in the house beginning a new drawing, and 2 7-year-olds arguing about something that was almost certainly not worth arguing about, and a 12-year-old young man standing beside her husband in the yard, already planning next spring. A husband who had heard a promise made in the dark and had let it change him. A home that had been empty for years and was no longer empty. A family assembled not from expectation but from choice. From the daily, accumulated, quiet choice of people who had each, in their own way, decided that this was worth fighting for. She had been willing to sacrifice anything. She had not expected to gain everything. But the land stretched green to the horizon under the October sky, and the house behind her was solid and warm, and her children's voices filled the yard, and Cole turned from where he was standing and looked back at her in the doorway, and the look on his face was the kind of look that has no performance in it, no calculation, no management, just a man seeing the thing he loves exactly where it is. She raised her hand. He raised his. Between them, Jesse had been removed from the vicinity of the bay horse and was making his case for why he should be allowed to try again. His argument detailed and passionate and entirely without merit. And Thomas was translating it to Cole with the expression of a lawyer presenting a client's position he personally finds unconvincing. The ranch ran on. The seasons would turn. The fences would need tending, and the horses would need watching, and the supply ledgers would need balancing, and the land would ask of them every year exactly what land always asks: steadiness, attention, the willingness to show up on the hard days as well as the easy ones. They would show up. All of them. 6 people who had each been, in their separate ways, lost, who had each known what it was to stand at the edge of something and feel the ground uncertain beneath them, had found, without planning it and without deserving it any more or less than anyone deserves the good things that come to them, the one thing that makes the endurance worth it. Not a perfect life. Not a life without hardship or grief or the ordinary persistent difficulty of living. Just this: people who would fight for each other. A family worth coming home to. The October light laid itself across the green land, and the house stood solid in it, and the voices of children filled the yard, and Rebecca Hartwell, some Rebecca Brennan now, the name still finding its shape in her mouth, stepped off the porch and walked toward her family, and the door swung shut behind her, and inside the house that was hers, on the land that was hers, in the life that was hers and no one could take, the morning continued its patient, ordinary, irreplaceable work of becoming afternoon.